Hi, welcome to Merpay Tech Fest 2021. I'm Wilson, and today I'm presenting about front-end testing as Cypress as a testing platform. So I joined Mercari and Merpay back in 2020, and since then I've worked on a number of our front-end products, including everything from our internal merchant tools, as well as the sites for our partners, as well as the application forms for our merchants as well. And so one of my big initiatives within Merpay is to promote testing as much as possible. And I'm here to share with you what we've done so far. So let me start out with a bit of background. And so Merpay actually launched back in 2019, back in February or March of 2019. And since then, we've really built a lot of stuff in the process. And so when we're trying to develop with so much velocity and developing new features all the time, front-end testing and testing in general is really important for us. And so one of the main reasons why we've decided to focus so much on testing in the past year is that we want to maintain our development velocity. We want to maintain kind of our confidence as we develop these products. And so one of the big advantages of having testing is, one, it reduces QA manual test requirements. And so with every release, we work with our QA teams to make sure that all of our releases are bug-free and safe. And so by having a lot of testing and automated testing especially, we can reduce those times that we require. Secondly, now that we have a lot of products that are all in production, when we do maintenance tasks or when we do refactoring, it's really important for us to have confidence that we can release and make changes without breaking any of our code. And so having testing is really important as well. And thirdly, since Merpay has grown a lot in the past year or two, and as our team has grown, testing is also really important for onboarding new team members. And so one of the key themes that you'll learn from this session is that our tests really act as our specifications. And so by reading the tests and by running the tests, people can understand what the product is supposed to do, kind of all the different scenarios that it's supposed to handle in certain ways. And we find that really powerful for onboarding new members. Lastly, it also helps us increase velocity in new feature development. And so one of the other things that we have at our toolkit is that we have a fully mocked backend that we've developed as part of our testing platform that allows us to basically mock the backend as we develop. And so we can develop simultaneously with the backend when we create new features. And so not only that, but we've written our tests in such a way that we can also write tests at the same time as we write feature code. And so as you can imagine, that also increases our development velocity a lot because we don't have dependencies on backend and we don't have dependencies on test writing either. And so we can all do it at the same time, and that really increases our development velocity. So what I want to introduce today is kind of how we use Cypress as our main testing stack. And so, of course, we do use some other tooling beyond Cypress, for example, for our unit tests. But what we found is that having Cypress as this kind of main platform for our testing has been extremely powerful because it allows us to many types of testing using the same stack. And we're able to use kind of a lot of the shared stuff that we built, for example, our API kind of mocks, our shared utilities, or reporting systems that are all shared between kind of all these types of testing, which makes it really easy for us to write tests. And so I want to start with the very bottom of this, of course, the very platform that we use, Cypress. So what is Cypress? So Cypress is a tool that is quite amazing. I think it's quite revolutionary in front-end testing. And what Cypress is it basically wraps kind of your typical Chromium-based browser, as you can see in this image here, in kind of a test wrapper. And so this test wrapper allows us to get access to anything that happens in the client. So for example, you can see in this image as well, we're able to query things in the client. We're also able to intercept and see anything that goes in and out of the client. So for example, you can see in this image as well, we're able to intercept post requests and requests in general, as well as responses from the server. And so what that basically gives us is this kind of testing environment that's really powerful because we can kind of control everything that happens within this environment. And you'll see a bit later kind of how we use it in a bit more detail as we go into kind of our mocks and some of the different tooling that we've built. So why Cypress instead of something of these these other testing libraries. So we before we adopted Cypress in such a significant way, we did test out a lot of different testing libraries. For example, as you may have heard of course, we used Jest and JS DOM, and for that testing, we also tried using Vue and React testing library. I think these are the three big points that I think are really differentiating for Cypress in terms of testing. So one of the key things we found is just that there's less mocking in general, and it's a real browser environment. And so if you've ever used Jest or JS DOM for testing, you realize that one, it doesn't fully replicate a real browser environment. There's a lot of things you have to mock out. And a lot of that mocking is actually quite challenging to do because it requires you to write a lot of custom code to mock out a lot of those functions. And so instead of doing that, Cypress allows us to basically run our application in a browser and it works fine. And so the challenge with having so many mocks as well is that you have less confidence in the tests. So you don't know if it's an issue with the mock itself, or you don't know if it's an issue with the app. And so they become not really real integration tests in my mind when you have to mock out things like asynchronous behaviors or Vuex stores or things like that. They're not really how the app works. Secondly, although Jest tests and some of these tests based on JS DOM do run faster, of course they do, because they don't have to render an entire DOM, there's significant issues with asynchronous behavior. And so one of the big issues was just being able to test things that are asynchronous and being able to, one of the things that we have to do, for example, in testing libraries is to actually wait for all these things to happen explicitly. And that's really quite difficult to do and quite annoying to test. Secondly, I think one of the great things about Cypress as well is that we get an immediate visual feedback. So you can debug tests because you can see exactly what's wrong. And one of the really powerful things is that you can also basically do test-driven development in Cypress, whereas you write tests as you go along, and that's your browser that you keep open all the time as you're developing code. And one of the other advantages of that visual feedback and having a real DOM is that you actually test what's happening in the DOM instead of looking at the code and testing implementation. And so that's one of the big philosophies that we have around testing, is that we test behavior instead of implementation. So we don't care about if the function runs or if there's a certain class applied or something like that. We just test based on what is actually visible in the DOM, what a user can see and do. And we find that makes our tests much more resilient as well. And so one of the things that I want to start with is this foundation that we've built for Cypress. And Cypress by itself is very powerful, but I think when combined with some of these other items, it becomes much more convenient. And so one of the things that we built for basically every single one of our applications is a full set of API mocks for every single endpoint that we use in that application. And so it looks something like this, right? So we built them all in TypeScript, so they're all type safe. At Merpay, we use gRPC for our backend, and so a lot of these types are actually automatically generated for us using some of the protobuf files provided by the backend. And so there's a lot of type safety that we can have, and all of our mocking is type safe. And so this is a really pretty simple function. And so yeah, they're all mock request generator, and they can be modified using the same function. Cypress also makes available request parameters when you mock the APIs. And so you can also use some of those parameters if you want to. We don't use that as much, but you can if you want. So what's really powerful by having all these mocks in general is that we can set up any environment that we want to test at anything we want, right? So sometimes in even in a real testing environment, it's really difficult to replicate some of the scenarios that we want to test. And so by having a fully mocked set of APIs, we can do anything we want to set up the test that we have. The second thing is that we also reuse these mocks quite a lot, actually. So for example, all of our projects also implement a mock server that we can run during development that just runs in the background. And we've implemented this both with mock service workers or just using a custom Node.js server. And so the reusability of these mocks is also quite powerful, and we're really glad that we have them most of the time. So the next thing that we found is really important is having these shared utilities. And so this is kind of an example. So Cypress lets you have these, what they call custom commands that you can build. And we built a lot of them in kind of our testing stack because we found them to be really convenient. And they make the test much more readable. So here's an example of some of the kind of custom commands we've built. So for example, sci.mock, it does what you expect. It mocks this endpoint. We also have assertions that we built that are custom as well, that we built on top of some of the utilities and API that Cypress provides. And one of the key things about kind of why we built these shared utilities is making tests easier to read and write. And so one, by having these kind of custom utilities that we've written, these tests are really readable. You can see exactly what the test is supposed to do and what it's asserting. Secondly, we also use kind of what Cypress calls function chaining in order to make the test even more readable. And so, for example, you can see that here, where we have sci.get test ID and the assertions all kind of chain on each other. And so it creates, when we use Prettier, for example, it creates really, really nice sections that you can see in the code that make it even easier to read. Lastly, we use a lot of file structure and sections in order to kind of organize the tests, which we find really important. Secondly, it also makes the test easier to write. And so these functions, for example, actually abstract away a lot of repetitive code that we don't want to see, for example, as well as using kind of the same functions also allows us to maintain the same kind of test structure very consistently across all of our tests. And because we've kind of written these functions in a certain way, these tests force you to kind of test on visible DOM elements only as well. So the last part that we built that is kind of on top of Cypress as well is our reporting. And so this is kind of what we built. So we use Cypress /code coverage for kind of normal code coverage, as well as we have kind of custom sci.task or sci.log functions that we've also built for kind of custom reporting. And so these tests are run either once every day, kind of on a custom cron schedule, or on every push to Circle CI. And so what we do is basically we upload all these test reports using GCP and cloud logging, and we're able to generate dashboards that display all this data using Looker. And so this is kind of one example of one of the reports that we have. So this is kind of code coverage for all our integration testing, as well as we have kind of more detailed reporting as well. And so, of course, what is really important about reporting dashboards in general is what gets measured gets managed. And so this is one of the first things that we built in order to really promote testing across all of our applications. And we found that to be really effective because they're very visual and you can see exactly kind of where we are in terms of our testing. So the next part I would like to move into is basically all the different types of tests that we're able to build on top of Cypress. And so the first is end-to-end regression testing. And so this is kind of the most typical use case for Cypress. And so this is done in collaboration with our QA teams. And so these tests actually don't use our mocks whatsoever, but they use the same shared utilities. So this is all done in our test environment. And these tests are run kind of during every QA period before every release. And so we found it really helpful in terms of kind of making sure that none of our applications have regressed. And it saves a lot of time for our QA teams as well. One of the additional things that we built for this is actually a custom helper that works with Postman JSON. So Postman, of course, is a utility that our QA teams use. And they maintain a lot of this kind of test requests in Postman. And we were able to build in Cypress, again, using a custom command that would run these Postman JSON files without any changes. And so, again, that kind of speaks to the power of what Cypress can do. Of course, this is used to create test data that we want to test in the test environment for every regression test run. Secondly, we have something called integration testing. And integration testing is a bit challenging because I think many people and many different teams have different definitions for it. What we mean by integration testing, and what I think that is the most important for integration testing, is really the integration of all front-end code, like the full client. And so that includes everything from kind of the business logic that we have in our code to the store and Vuex kind of state management libraries that we use, as well as, of course, the kind of components that we've built. And so the general rule of thumb that we have is that we only mock the API and nothing else. And so it's a fully functioning app inside of Cypress. And so all that we do to kind of set up the environment and perform tests is we mock API responses and we do certain user actions with the DOM. And kind of what we can assert and what we output is kind of, is the DOM rendered correctly? And do we make the right API requests when a user performs a certain action? And so in the same way that we discussed before, we test behavior, we don't test implementation as much as possible. And so kind of the tests that we do in this kind of integration testing umbrella is kind of these 4 big headings. So rendering, given a response, do we render the correct things? Permissions, so given a response and a certain authentication state, do we display the correct things, and are we allowing users to do things that they're allowed to do? Thirdly, validation. So when users kind of submit a form or fill out a form, do we validate all their inputs correctly? And action. So when a user clicks a button or submits a certain form or something, do we generate the correct request, and do we update the DOM correctly? And so this is kind of an example of the test structure that we kind of described. And so we have these big headings, again, rendering, validation, actions, and we write specific tests for each one of those sections. And we found that this really helps us keep organized in our testing and make sure that we cover all the test cases that we want to cover. And so again, this is really powerful because it allows us to test things kind of really in terms of what the specification specifies, right? And so it's not mocked at all. It's just really what's happening in the DOM. And again, through the power of these shared utilities and API mocks, we're able to test anything that we want within this integration testing environment. So next is accessibility testing. And so one of the other things that's been really powerful about Cypress is that the ecosystem is really great. And all of these people have built a lot of plugins and tooling that allow us to kind of extend the core functionality of Cypress a lot more and introduce things like accessibility testing as well. So we use Cypress Acts as kind of our key integration plugin. And as a general rule, we've also adopted Acts as our standard accessibility kind of testing throughout all of our team. And so it makes it really easy because there's so much kind of we've already done in terms of being able to mock and set up a page that we want. So again, what we basically do is use the same mocks and same utilities to render a full page or open a dialog or something, some set of actions that sets the Cypress environment up for testing. We run the Acts test against the rendered page, and we log all those results. And so, for example, again, very typically, we measure the number of accessibility violations per page. And we also have a kind of a threshold for the number of pages that need to pass. And all this is logged and set up in our GCP as well. And again, it's a really powerful tool that we have for accessibility testing that makes it really, really easy to do. And of course, because it's all kind of the same Cypress commands, everything that we built for this specific integration can be shared across basically every single project that we have. So the next thing is kind of along the same lines as that as well. So performance testing. And so for that, we use Lighthouse, which is kind of the gold standard for performance as well. It's also very, very much the same pattern, right? So we use the same mock APIs. We use the same kind of shared utilities, and we actually use the same dashboards as well. And we're able to set up these environments and basically render the page and then run performance tests against as well. I think one of the extra special kind of things about performance testing in Cypress is that we're able to run tests in different environments. So for example, we can either choose to build the app as a like server-side rendered app or a single page app. We're able to choose to either use the mocked APIs or use the APIs in the test environment. And through that, we're able to diagnose performance issues in a lot more detail. Like, is it an issue kind of on the client side in terms of SPA versus SSR? Is it kind of an issue with response time? And so I think that's really powerful that we're able to create these variations that help us diagnose kind of in more detail all the issues with performance that we have. So again, we have the same typical performance metrics that, that Lighthouse provides. These metrics are measured on a per page level, and we use the same kind of dashboard system in order to track all these metrics as well over time. So next, we're kind of moving into what we haven't done, but we really want to do in the future. And one of those big things, again, because it's so easy to do in Cypress, is visual regression testing. And so we imagine it actually is really similar to kind of the same pattern that we have for performance and accessibility. We have a page, we're able to render any version of the page that we want, and we simply go in and keep track and do a diff of that page with kind of a past version of the page that we have. And so we believe that we can do this quite easily in Cypress as well. There's a number of options that we have to consider, like Cypress plugin snapshots, Cypress visual regression, Cypress image diff, a lot of tooling, again, that's available, again, because of the great ecosystem that's available for Cypress. And I think we're able to build this kind of as a big next step. One of our challenges right now, and one of the things that we want to do, is to build our own kind of interface for viewing the results of this test. And so that's kind of what's holding up our ability to build this type of testing right now. But again, I have 100% confidence that we can build this kind of in the near future. And it will also kind of take a lot of load off of our QA teams who have to do visual inspections kind of with every release. Whereas if we have this kind of interface for them to see the difference between kind of version before and version now, we can make it much easier for them to kind of just verify that nothing has changed or that the correct changes have been made. Lastly, I think this is kind of even more new in terms of the Cypress ecosystem is component testing. And so component testing we still do right now. We use a combination of Storybook and Jest in order to do our component tests. And they're kind of what you expect is very, very typical component tests. And so the difference between kind of component testing within Cypress, which again, this is quite new, they introduced this in April, is that instead of rendering an entire page, you're just rendering kind of one single component. And you can kind of still use all of the APIs that Cypress allows you to. And so you can still use the kind of helpers to manipulate the DOM. You can still use the same assertions. And again, so I expect that we can kind of reuse a lot of the code that we use there as well. And so I think there is potentially a lot of potential here in the sense that Cypress is building out a lot of support to mock global variables to make it even easier for us to do. But I think one of the issues is that it's still quite new. And still the combination of Storybook and Jest, I think, is a bit more robust, especially for component testing. But I think for Cypress, what's really powerful is that you can have that kind of interactivity that makes it really important for certain types of components. And it could potentially be a replacement for Storybook or Jest in the future for us. But again, this is kind of a big, kind of very new feature that I wanted to kind of bring up as well, because just to show the potential of Cypress and kind of what we're able to do. So just to kind of go over this stack again, like what is really important about having kind of what we would consider an entire testing stack is just the reusability of the code, right? And so again, having Cypress as this kind of foundational platform for running all these tests, and then having these API mocks and shared utilities and same reporting system allows us to build out these tests really, really easily. And I think as someone who's trying to promote testing in our team and someone who's trying to promote testing everywhere, quite frankly, I think it's really important to make tests easy and really pleasant to write as well. Like when I first started writing tests in general, I think most people kind of in the same position as a front-end engineer. One, you don't really have that much familiarity with tests because, frankly, a lot of front-end teams don't write any tests at all. But secondly, it's really difficult to write tests for front-end because I think for back-end, there's a lot more kind of what you would have your kind of typical unit tests and integration tests. Whereas as with everything else in the front-end, like it's kind of like a Wild West for testing. And what I think we accomplished in the past year or so is that we've been able to kind of really clarify our ability to write tests in a very robust way. And to write them in a very intuitive way as well, right? And so as front-end engineers, we're used to interacting with a client, and Cypress really allows us to interact with the client in a very natural way and to write tests in a very natural way. And I think the more that we can promote kind of, again, easy testing, and again, this foundation is what really is the most important for making tests as easy as possible. Again, the more tests that we can build in the future and the better, and the more that we can guarantee that our testing really gives us confidence in our application and kind of makes our development much more smooth and much more quick. And so that's about it. So I hope that I've convinced you that there is kind of a better way to do testing inside the front end, especially kind of beyond component testing and beyond unit testing, that I think is much more well established. But there's kind of all these other tests that we can do very easily using a platform like Cypress. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you for joining Merpay TechFest 2021 this year. And that's all from me.